Akile is the head of inclusive education at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's the lead of the Eden Centre for Educational Enhancement. She's been involved in numerous projects, and her research background is in human geography and sociology, where she's developed innovative and underrepresented and represented research projects on spaces of power and resistance in higher education and social justice. And she's going to talk about a number of these projects as she talks through her keynote. And I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to Akile now, if you want to start uploading your slides. And I will keep an eye on the chat throughout and just take Akile's lead. And we will have time at the end for a discussion if you want to kind of like unmute yourself, turn on your camera, or just continue putting comments into the chat. So I'm absolutely delighted to hand over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tracy. And sorry I'm a bit late. I didn't actually have the link to join, so it's really great to be here. And I want to firstly thank QUB for inviting me to this conference and for centering a really important theme around sort of ticking boxes, particularly in relation to the work that I do and that we're all sort of endeavouring in higher education. I haven't been able to attend the previous sessions, unfortunately, because I was down with COVID, but having looked through the themes, I'm really, really grateful to the previous keynotes and paper presentations on exploring aspects of student partnership and sustainability, health and wellbeing in the curriculum, and internationalisation. And I am going to return to some of the themes that have been discussed by the previous speakers, but I also want to question things such as equitable student partnership, belonging versus unbelonging, and how the university frames things such as well-being versus the lived reality for staff and students in the university, and also challenging concepts such as decolonising and diversification and how they've become operationalised in the university setting. And what I really want to do today, and please do put your notes into the chat, questions, comments, to consider this idea of the continuum and how we work collectively to do this work in higher education on inclusive education, and that there's no real start to this work and that there's no real end to it. And it's very much a continuum, and it's very much us working collectively together. But before I sort of proceed with what I'm going to say, I'd really like to set this space up. And I've borrowed this principled space document from my colleagues from building the anti-racist classroom. And I use this a lot in my teaching, and this is part of the work that we do at the LSE as well in setting up the space for students and staff in conferences and teaching. So just 5 basic principles for today, in that: be aware of your privilege and take a step back so marginalised people can lead consciously, challenging any implicit hierarchy where gender trumps other dimensions of marginalisation and including race. Believe people's accounts of their experiences of marginalisation and honour people's vulnerability by not disputing their lived experiences, and definitely keeping in mind principle number 1. All the experiences that are shared here may be deeply personal and should be treated in confidence. While we can't guarantee full confidentiality, I'd like to request that unless explicit consent is requested and given, that discussions held in this room should stay in this room. I encourage participants to tweet, make posts, comments and critique, but to also respect other participants. I would urge you not to make derogatory comments or post any person's experience in the room or anything that I share in terms of any narratives without explicit consent. And while these principles are intended to apply to all of us, they are written in recognition of existing power structures that continue to marginalise people of colour, perpetuate anti-blackness, and promote white privilege and power. And this should be kept in mind throughout the whole session. Thank you. So the aims of the session, what I want to do is to think about what does higher education look like and set the scene around UK higher education in particular. And I'll firstly sort of focus particularly on home UK students, but also be including international student experience, because having now at the LSE 70% of our students are international, so we need to acknowledge the international student experience. I will then present some data from Advanced HE on student and staff numbers, and some of you may have already seen this data, and some HESA data as well. The data itself tells a story in numbers. I will then be sharing with you all findings from my own research, which focuses on the experiences of racialised postgraduate and PGR students and staff, predominantly in Russell Group universities. These 2 stories are important. I want you all to think about the physical space of the university as I speak, because to engage with the physical space of the university is to be reminded of the power space has to make one feel inside or outside. Previous research by Puar on women in Parliament, she argues that space is not only abstract and subject to calculus and homogeneous control, but it is also lived and has an interwoven series of local encounters involving sensuous connections and imaginations. And there's also been a lot of work in geography by Kwame Harrison, which looks at the racial spatialization. And I really want you to kind of place yourselves into the space of the university and even in this conference space whilst I work through what I'm going to discuss. And then finally, I'm going to introduce some of the work that we've been doing at LSE, which is focusing on embedding inclusive education across the whole school and not viewing it as something that's tacked on to either EDI policy, widening participation policy, or something that sits external in a separate centre, but is a whole school approach. So setting the scene. So we all know that the UK higher education sector has become more and more market driven. My own journey into higher education started in 2000, where fees were just being introduced. And my parents really pushed me to go to university because it was a route in for a better life for me. They had arrived in England in the 1970s and they wanted a better life for myself and for my siblings. So university felt like the best thing for me to do. But it was a very different time. And we've seen since the UK has kind of expanded its policy and widening participation and a real push to include and widen the pool of people that come to university. Alongside that, we've seen changes in diversity and inclusion policies in universities. We now have EDI teams and leaders in universities. And we also now have moved on from the widening participation to access and participation. So it's not just about getting students in, but it's about supporting students when they do arrive at university. And this couldn't have come sooner because many of us will be aware of the grade awarding gap that exists between white students and students that identify as Black, Asian, minority ethnic, and also the gap between students that are disabled and non-disabled. So it's a really good move, but we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we have these gaps? Why is there a grade awarding gap? And previously, it's always been sent down to the individual level of the student. So it's always viewed as very much deficit. So we will see on universities' websites, and I've just taken this from a number of different universities. So they'll claim things like whoever you are, wherever you've come from, whatever you're worried about will be here. You see things like let's celebrate and support diverse and inclusive communities, equality and diversity, think differently and do differently. So this is common. You see this whole exercise happen across websites. And if we think back to 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, there was a huge push from institutions to centre race. And then we look at this picture in data. So this is taken from the recent HESA data, and you can access this from the website. It's freely available to you all. And we see a pretty good picture. We're seeing an increase in number of students that have declared disabilities. That doesn't mean all students declare disabilities because we know not all students do, but we see a really good picture if we look from what was happening in 2016 to where we're at in 2021. And again, with ethnicity, we've seen small steps in growth. We've not had a huge, it's been pretty consistent, as you can see in this data. So this paints a really good picture, I'd say, that we've widened access, but we also know that the majority of students that will identify as Black, Asian and minority ethnic and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, however we define that pool of students, are mainly concentrated in teaching intensive and non-Russell universities. So we have to think about where do students go to study? Why do they make those decisions as well? If we then go down deeper into the data that Advanced HE has recently put, and these infographics are all available on the Advanced HE website, we start to see what's going, and then I think it was last week Kalwant Bhopal also presented some of this data. So many of you that attended her talk last week, I'm really sorry for the repeat, but we start to see a gap, right? 90% of professors in the UK are white. 0.6% of professors are Black. Those of us that work in universities and study universities will see this as we walk the corridors, as we go to lectures, as we enter meetings. It's very much apparent. And again, this is a really interesting statistic. If we look at the pipeline for UK students and staff, we see it widening at professor level for white versus BA/ME. That's a huge gap between those two groups. So you can see as you go through your career path, if you choose to go on to do a PhD, that gap becomes wider and wider. Oops, sorry, I'm really bad on Teams. Oh. Right, here we go. And then if we look at the intersection of this data again, if we look at gender, we look at this, we see white male professors take up 64%. And then we've got, and I'm using Black, Asian, minority, ethnic purely for policy purposes, and that's what we're using in the UK. It's not a term that I'd necessarily agree with, but for ease of understanding here and because of the data, I'm using that term. We've got 2.5% BA/ME female professors. And again, if we look at this pipeline, we see a growing gap. And then further, we look at heads of institutions. Again, we don't really need to look at the data to see what's around us in our everyday, in our working environments, in our learning environments. 94.8% heads of institutions are white and 5.2% identify as Black, Asian and minority ethnic. And again, this is a further breaking down of the data of UK academics and what status they're at professorial level. So we've got professors versus non-professors, and that will vary depending on how your institution. So at the LSE, entry level is assistant professor. In other universities, it will be lecturer, senior lecturer, reader, and it's a slightly different model at the LSE. But again, this is representing a collective here. And again, I'm sure many of you are now familiar with this data. For those of you that are not, the student attainment across ethnic groups, this has been a long conversation that's been happening for many years now, and there's been lots of research into the experiences of students that are racialized. So we see here that 86% of white students are more likely to be awarded a first class or a 2-1 degree versus 66% of Black students. And this will vary across institutions, but it's still a gap. And what I found really interesting here that Advanced HE have done is the awarding gap between students whose parents had a higher education qualification and those who did not. I know that the OFS are now really keen to look at socioeconomic status, and we at the LSE have been really trying to work out what does it look like, how do we define socioeconomic status, and I think it's a really interesting presentation of the data. So that's the story in numbers, okay? So we've got EDI policies, we've got widening participation policies, we've got local level policies. Each institution will have, I'm sure many of you will have strategies in your institutions. We certainly do at the LSE. But is there a culture of diversity, or is there a culture of value in diversity? And this was a quote, well, it's a tweet actually by Barna Hayser that he put out in 2020. And this sort of was just after many universities were putting out statements around Black Lives Matter. And I've used this in a recent paper because I think it's really, it strikes a chord with me. Diversity becomes a rabbit hole when it's pursued as an alternative to anti-racism, when it glosses over racial hierarchy and racial segregation, when it fails to challenge white supremacy, when it is simply there to enhance the boutique experience of the white consumer. And I really kind of want you to think about that, given what I've said so far. Now, I'm a geographer by training, so like the idea of space is really important to me. But one thing from my own experience and the research that I've done and the role that I'm in now is this idea of these as universities as liberal spaces, as spaces where we create knowledge, we create research, they're liberal spaces, but actually they're quite unwelcoming spaces. And Robbie Shilliam wrote a piece in 2015 as part of the Running Me Trust project that was authored by Jason Ade and Claire Alexandra. He's written a piece in that. And again, I strongly urge you to read that document if you haven't done so. He says, universities remain overwhelmingly, administratively, normatively, habitually and intellectually white. The doors have been opened, but the architecture remains the same. And again, Divya Tolya-Kelly, a geographer, also has written about her own experiences of being in the university and the felt violences that are part of the everyday life of our students, researchers and academic colleagues within institutions. This is not a new phenomenon. And then many of you will know Sarah Ahmed's work, and Sarah Ahmed gave a talk just sort of after the first lockdown, and she was using this idea of the door that I found really powerful. And so doors tell us how institutions function, for whom they function, how only some are allowed to enter, how others become trespassers. So again, I really kind of want you to think about the space and the policies that we have in place for people to come to university, even recruitment policies that we think about to diversify the student body, to diversify the staff body. But what about the people that embody that diversity? What about people like me, people like my colleagues that have done this work as well? So Sarah Ahmed's work, Kalwant Bhopal's work, Nicola Rollock's work. You know, when I've spoken to sort of early career researchers, early career academics and students, you know, these are just some quotes from some research that I did. I have learned that the university may want my colour, but not my voice. The university may open itself to diverse students, but there is an expectation that we will be grateful, quiet, and maintain the university image. Another quote is, diversity, I do not make anyone uncomfortable by taking up more space than necessary. And again, so I really kind of carry on reading. It strikes a chord because we've got these policies, we've got practice. We also have a positive experience for some students. It's not to say that everyone's having a negative experience. But how does it feel once you enter into these spaces? Okay, what picture do we paint? So between 2017 and 2020, I did quite a long research project, which involves 3 different methods of in-depth interviewing, focus groups, and photo voice. And the focus was on PGT, PGR, and staff, mainly early career staff in universities, and really wanted to look at the sort of using photo voice enabled me to gain access to the spaces and for it to be a continuous piece of work. And some of you may have seen some of these images already from a paper that I've already published, but this is one image, and this is an image of a security guard, of a black male security guard in a corridor. And this is from a PhD student at the time, and he writes, dreams of possession. At all times, it appears that people like me are propping up the institution of which they should be part of. Even when we are inside, we are outside. Fanon tells us that the look that the native turns on the settler's town is a look of lust, a look of envy. It expresses his dreams of possession, all manner of possession. To sit at the settler's table, to sleep in the settler's bed with his wife if possible. The colonized man is an envious man, and the settler knows very well. When their glances meet, he ascertains bitterly, always on the defensive. They want to take our place. It is true, for there is no native who does not dream at least once, one day, of setting up himself at the settler's place. Another image that many of the students took and photographed was of the cleaning staff, and the image that I have here is of the cleaner's cart. And certainly at the LSE, you may miss the cleaners unless you're in very early in the morning. And one of the students wrote this very powerful narrative alongside this image. I'm going to leave this up for you to read for a moment. I'm not going to read it out, but it really does hit home this idea of charter marks, of you know, targets that we have to meet, and it takes it to a whole other level. So I'm just going to leave it here for you lot to read. And again, this was a really common theme for quite a few students that were in the focus group and took part in the Photo Voice project. Their institutions were applying for their race equality charter marks. And it was a case that the charter mark would have given the institution a stamp of approval that it was racially equitable, but for many of the students, it was about maintaining a particular image. Another image that was quite common is this idea of the walls that surround, particularly at the older universities, when you go into the dining rooms or into the libraries, you see paintings of previous directors, of previous pro-vice chancellors. And again, that is like the whiteness in the walls that surround us always. I'm just going to stop presenting and pause for a moment because it's quite a lot to take in. I can't actually see the chat at all, Tracy, so I have no idea of any questions, but I just thought it'd be quite because it's a lot to take in at that point, and it's quite a lot of data and it's quite overwhelming. So if anybody has any questions at this point, that'd be really great.
So I can't see any questions at the moment, but we will, we can pause and we can ask if anyone wants to ask anything. And apologies, I have builders next door, so they've just started banging. So if anyone wants to put your hand up or ask a question, you're more than welcome to do that. Yeah, so Belinda has just asked there, I've used this myself in research. I'm a big fan of photo voice. So just as a method, can you just talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I've used photo voice a few times. I mean, many years ago it was called photo diaries, and it's a really great way of getting into the world of your participant, and it's been quite continuous. So what we did is we had a session with the students first. We did a focus group initially, where we asked a series of questions around the research. Then we used the themes from that focus group to sort of discuss what kind of images students would take, and use those themes from the focus group to narrate to the students, well, if you could frame your photographs around these, but they weren't limited, if that makes sense, but you have to guide your students. And we spent a lot of time with them, sort of how to take a photograph, and there's lots of videos that we used. There was an organisation called photovoice.org, and I'd gone along for a course with them, and they'd sort of taught me how to use the camera to frame, because it's all about framing as well, and who is viewing that photo. So the students were then given cameras, those that didn't have any cameras. I mean, most of them had phones that they used anyway, but quite a lot of them chose to use quite sophisticated cameras. And they were given 3 weeks to photograph their racialized experiences of campus and beyond if they wanted to as well. And then we regrouped with the photographs, and then they all presented their images back to us collectively, talked us through them, and then we actually had an exhibition afterwards as well. It's a really great method. It's powerful, but it's also it exposes you as a participant, as an individual, your feelings, but it's a really great way, particularly if you're looking at things like kind of race and racism in an institution, and how a space can make that. We talk about belonging so much in the student body. How do we kind of envision that? And that was done through photo voice. So I really recommend it. There's so much literature out there. I mean, previously, you'll know, Tracy, if you've used this before, it was really kind of participatory action research. People were using photo voice. So yeah, I really recommend it.
Yeah, we did the same. It was actually on Spaces as well. It was learning spaces with secondary school students many years ago, and it was disposable cameras. So, before mobile phones. And what was interesting about that, when they came back, you have to actually, you get a real sense of the wider family, because a lot of they went into their home personal spaces and things like that. So we had to kind of make decisions around what do you feel safe to actually share with the wider audience outside of this kind of safe group, and have lots of conversations around what that meant and how they were going to present their work and things like that. So I used it with PAR as well, participatory action research. So it's a really nice method. So I'm just seeing yeah, people are really happy, just wanting to know more about it. I feel in slow progress and inclusion is still progress. Any thoughts on that? Because of course EDI is so big, and I feel everyone is putting everything under EDI. And then of course, I think now people are kind of seeing it more as, well, it's too much now, I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. So there's a couple of things there. And then another question was, with the obvious white dominance in HEIs, what ways can we challenge current mechanisms that don't allow the voice of our students to be heard? It's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think it's actually flipping that, in that it's not that the voices aren't heard, that people are choosing not to listen sometimes, or hearing it in a particular way. And I agree, this idea of how do we include, it's almost difficult to even say, well, what are we being included into, right? And it's that structure, like, you don't want to be included, you want to be part of it. And it's so difficult. I think hearing, it's actually quite easy sometimes. I say, in this role, it's about seeing and valuing your students, who's in your classroom, seeing them, valuing what they're saying. And it's not a case of, I'm going to diversify my curriculum and then that's it. It's much bigger than that. And we also have to acknowledge, and I say this so often, and others have said this before me, universities are really powerful places. We create knowledge, we create research. It's not just applying this work to our teaching, but it's applying it to our research practice as well. And I think sometimes that is missed. And so we need to bring those all together and acknowledge all of that. And that's part of the decolonizing process, is sort of stripping back and starting again.
That's the importance, isn't it, around, it's not just academics, actually. It's, yes, it's the teaching and learning space. It's how we encourage our learners to learn outside of the physical space, in our virtual spaces, in our libraries, in our cafeterias, everywhere, and our administrative staff and everything. And it's people using that kind of shared language and terminology that's really important.
Great. I'm going to move on to my next set of slides, because that comes really nicely and may answer some of your questions. Okay, go forward again. So I'm going to sound like LSE is the greatest place ever here, but this is mainly because it's my work and my colleagues, who some of them are actually in the room today. So what I've tried really hard to do in my current role is to really encourage the LSE to take a whole school approach. And I think this was something that one of the speakers touched on when they were talking about student partnership and student voice and well-being. It's about moving beyond those targets and highlighting other proxies for attainment. I think whilst it's important that those grade awarding gaps are eliminated, we also have to acknowledge that students can come to university from diverse backgrounds, get really high grades, but there's huge consequences for having to fit yourself into those structures. And I know that from my own personal experience. We have to centre race, and that means encountering discomfort. Some of what I'm saying today may be uncomfortable for some people, but it's working through that discomfort. It's also recognising that there are student identities, not just a student identity, and that will change and transform as students go through their journey in higher education. And it's also about raising consciousness, and it's not something that you go along to a workshop and you're done and dusted with. So we have what we've called the Inclusive Education Action Plan, and there are 5 areas of work in that. The first one focuses on academic mentoring, and what we've really tried to do with this plan is to say, right, we are trying to induct, we don't want to induct what is deemed different into these established dominant structures, as I've said previously, but we want the structures to start to change, right, and rebuild, and that will take time. But academic mentoring, and some of you may, many universities call this personal tutoring, but LSE is called academic mentoring, is such an important part of the student experience and the student journey. And it really is a really central part if we want to encourage students, particularly racialized students, to go on and do PhDs. The relationship, that scholarly relationship that you have with your students. Sometimes the focus becomes on pastoral care and supporting students. And yes, that's incredibly important. But sometimes students just want to talk about what interests them, what they're curious about. And I think we really have to centre that. The second area looks at curriculum enhancement. And what we've done in that is that we're kind of looking at course aims and content and outcomes. And we've stripped that into 2 different areas of diversifying and decolonising, because I professionally and personally don't believe any institution is quite ready yet to decolonise. And we shouldn't sort of have this theatre of decolonising. It has to be true decolonising. And we've sort of defined diversification around kind of looking at a global and varied perspective in your course content. And the purpose of that diversification is to make visible the perspectives and identities often marginalised. And it also involves developing the canon further. I think sometimes people think we can't take away the canon, but we're not asking anyone to take away the canons in their schools of thought. It's about how they're used and how we can develop them further. And then we're really focusing on decolonising epistemologies and its process of critical thinking and challenging Eurocentric modes of thinking, which are linked to colonialism. And acknowledging that actually knowledge itself is colonised. It isn't simply a case, and we found this as we've kind of been doing our work at the LSE, that adding scholars from the global south isn't decolonising, because a lot of the schools of thought, a lot of institutions in the global south are also Western and Westernised universities. So we really have to be careful about how we use decolonising. The third area of work is around inclusive pedagogies. And again, as I said, it's not about embedding students into systems which excludes them from the onset, but rather kind of transforming and democratising our pedagogies. The fourth area of work is it's actually a research project that will be ongoing around developing higher education identities. And we've been carrying out research with first, second and third year undergraduates, doing, again, something really in-depth with diaries with students, interviews, because we really want to think about how do we have a continuous kind of induction process for first years, for second years and third years. What happens to students in their identities in the first years? How are they building relationships? How are they finding what sparks their curiosity through research? What skills? And it's not a stop and start research project, but we'll continually do this work. And the final area of the plan is building and developing anti-racism. And so I'm just going to talk you through some brief work. So at the LSE, we've done some research into academic mentoring and how students experience, how academic mentors feel about mentoring as well, because again, we mustn't forget it's a really stressful job to mentor students and to do this work. And it shouldn't just fall on the academic identified mentors. It's all of the school, it's all of the teaching staff that engage with students should be part of this. We have an academic mentoring community of practice that meets fortnightly. We've developed academic mentoring principles, which build on what we have as the academic code, but slightly more informal. We have reflective sessions for mentors that's been run by our counselling service. We run sessions on, we're entitled Caring or Crisis Management, what is academic mentoring? And we continuously want to do research into this area because it's changing all the time. The student body is changing, their needs are changing. And curriculum enhancement, we're established principles around diversifying and what it means to diversify. We are acknowledging the difference between quantitative and qualitative, which is really important at the LSE. And I'm certainly guilty of centering my comfort in qualitative work. So it's important that we think about curriculum and diversification of a curriculum for quantitative subjects. We've got something called change makers, which are student-led projects, which are calls to actions. And we've appointed what we've called attainment leads across all of the undergraduate departments. Now, the attainment leads are really important in that they are the people in the departments that will lead the improvements through the Inclusive Education Action Plan. So I've just noticed the typo, apologies. They disseminate the relevant data and good practice. They support their staff in achieving and creation of this inclusive education. And they consult with staff and students when necessary to carry out research. Again, we have to be really careful. It's something that I haven't spoken about yet. But over-research of students, particularly around our racialised students or our non-traditional students as well, we know what's going on and we know the problems in our institutions. Continuously doing research with our students and presenting that as the solution is really not making any change. It's a lot of labour. It's a lot of trauma for students as well to constantly talk about their experiences. And the attainment leads also work closely with me. So the key here is to have a point of contact in the departments. Around decolonising, we really kind of want to reverse the gaze, as I've said before, and go beyond this decolonising theatre. So we're working with departments. We've got a seminar series. We've just launched and appointed fellowships in decolonising across different departments. And what that is doing is encouraging people in their own disciplines to work through what would decolonising look like in sociology, in social policy, for geography, because it's very, very different. And I think some of it we have to do a little bit of intellectual work to then get to the practicalities of it, particularly in a place like the LSE where research is really, really important. And again, inclusive pedagogies is around dismantling these dominant structures. The ground clearing practices I discussed earlier are part and parcel of what we deliver. Engaging in difficult dialogue, this is a really important piece of work, is sometimes it's difficult to have these conversations in the classroom. Netiquette guidance, again, the shift online has changed things so much. And I think it's a really good time now to move beyond that emergency response that we all had in the pandemic to really thinking about how can we make inclusive, equitable spaces online. We've just recently launched something called the Inclusive Education Mapping Exercise, which is built on, some of you may have seen the UCL Curriculum Health Check. I wanted to develop something, again, that was this continuum and reflective and is asking people, whatever journey they are on in education, around inclusion, around diversity, decolonising race, to be able to reflect on their practice and to seek support and collaborate. We've got a student education panel that is run by one of my colleagues, our student education partnership coordinator. We've co-facilitated sessions with them. We also have a fantastic blog called the LSE Higher Education blog, which is also full of resources for both LSE and external. Please do take a look. And then the final bit is building knowledge to enable change. And as uncomfortable as it may make people to talk about race and anti-racism, I'm really pleased that we've been able to centre race in our conversation in this work. And so I've been running a series of workshops with academic staff and professional staff around anti-racism. So it's a series of 6 sessions that ideally you would attend all of them, but we look at anti-racism in higher education, whiteness in the academy, diversity and higher education, anti-racist pedagogy, inclusive curriculum, and race and disability in the academy. I think it's really important that we create those spaces for staff to be able to ask questions. As I said before, not everyone is at the same stage, and that's okay. It's bringing people on the journey with you, and you know, all of us are learning. You know, I don't have all the answers. We don't all know what the answer to some of these questions are. And it's about continuously kind of making sure that we are educating one another and sharing knowledge and sharing some vulnerabilities as well. We've also launched a series very recently of ableism in the academy as well. And that again is around rephrasing and reframing disability, going beyond inclusion plans. And again, looking at the online world, sometimes people will assume that online means it's inclusive and accessible, and that's not necessarily the case just because it's online. So that's sort of some of the work that we're doing at the LSE. I've sort of done a whistle-stop tour of it, but I'm really proud of the work that we're doing, and welcome any questions. It'll be great to hear what other universities are doing as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Akile. I'm sure everybody agrees that that was very riveting, and some, you know, highlights some of the great work that you're doing at LSE. If anybody wants to, because we have a few minutes before we pause before our second set of sessions, so you're more than welcome to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and you ask a direct question yourself. I think I asked most of the questions. There was one question there, and I think I actually asked a question as well. What are your thoughts around reverse mentoring? And if you do that at LSE, or if you've had any feedback from that, because we are actively trying to do that or get that off the ground in QUB, without much success, to be honest, for many obvious reasons, for exactly the people that are, I suppose, often over burdened and often asked to do more and without really knowing what they're going to get out of this. So, but I suppose that, you know, people feel that this would be, it's been piloted, but it hasn't gone off the ground yet for you know, I'm just wondering, have you ever tried it, or you know anybody, other institution that does it?
We haven't tried it. But I know that there are some institutions, I can't remember off the top of my head which ones, but we're yet to do that, Tracy, because I don't think we've actually got the mentoring right just yet, let alone the sort of reverse mentoring, I think. So I'll be really interested to hear if other people in the room have any experience of reverse mentoring as well.
Yeah, great. If you do, you can either write in the comments or you can put your hand up and ask a question. That'd be great. Tahir asked, do you think that seeing diversified staff can be a sort of long-term establishment of better student inclusion?
That is a really good question. And I'd say yes, it matters so much. And I hadn't realised how much it mattered until I was working at Middlesex a couple of years ago as a senior lecturer, and I had students that would come up to me and just thank me for being in the room, for doing a PhD, and for being at the front and saying, I never thought I'd see someone that looks like me, sounds like he's from the same part of the world as me, and it means so much, and it's making me want to pursue this work. So definitely. But the other side of it is so difficult to be in the university, to be a person of colour, and I think the universities need to do more. As I said, if we look at those numbers, the pathway up is non-existent for some of us. The pay gaps, we're not even thinking about pay, but just the lived experiences and the trauma. Universities have to start, acknowledging that and looking after staff and caring for staff and promoting staff. It's not just about bringing in and hiring Black professors, for example. It's about promoting the Black staff that are already in the institution, supporting their promotions, valuing teaching and learning, and valuing things like mentoring. Tracy, you realise some of this work doesn't count towards promotions. Right, all of the soft skills that we give and they're really important to some of us, they're not promotable. So the institution has to really change its culture. But 100% agree. It would have changed my experience if I saw someone that looked like me and sounded like me. It would have made my PhD experience, for example, so much easier.
Yeah, and you just made a really nice point there, Akile, about the more you give and the more of your personal self that you give around student support or mentorship or whatever. And as you said, it's not always recognised. And actually the people who do that are the people who give the most. And actually it's a huge amount of, like, maybe even sharing your own trauma or your own lived experience. And that can be exhausting. And the hours that takes, to do that, and you might often be doing it in the evenings even and outside of work hours. So I absolutely agree there. Jen McParland, my friend, hello Jen, said there is a lot of well-intended talk in higher ed about belonging, but doesn't it assume that everyone wants to belong? Isn't it possible that you might not choose to belong to an institution based on its values, its decisions, its actions, etc.? So is mattering a better term than belonging? I've heard this actually a few times recently. If we keep shifting terms, I don't know where we're going to end up, but a lot of people are talking about that difference now of the term of belonging versus mattering.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was at a talk a couple of years ago and I can't remember who said it now. My COVID brain is pretty bad, I'm afraid. But they shifted it and said it's not about belonging, but it's about the university belonging to us. And so actually shifting the way it's framed, because you're right, not everybody wants to belong, and everyone comes to university for different reasons, and students will come in, get their head down to get the degrees that they want to get, and then want to move on and get a job. They don't really want to be part of the fabric or part of anything, really, because it's too difficult. But I hadn't heard that around mattering. It's a really good point, yeah.
So again, if anyone wants to unmute or put your hand up to ask a question, we have another few minutes. Sometimes people are a little bit shy at the beginning, so we can, but there's plenty of people in the room, so I'm sure you can, there's about 53 people in the room, so please do ask a question. And I'll ask you a question there while we're just waiting, Akile. So for me, around diversifying the curriculum and decolonizing the curriculum, and people, are kind of that comfort of I'll go first and try to kind of focus around diversifying. And you even called out in your slides around, we need to really shift and move beyond this diversifying the reading list, and where, as you said, where we're drawing our knowledge from. And yes, we're increasing our international staff all the time, and they, whether that they come from a traditional kind of education setting, the process of how they're taught, and bringing that knowledge. But again, it can often be that westernized kind of where they're drawing their knowledge from. So what kind of sense are you getting from your own staff at LSE around the difference between diversifying and decolonizing, and how deep have you actually got? Because we have tried to do a number of seminars, a number of talks, and there are staff that are actively trying to make small changes. But for me, we can't put that onus on only an individual, because if we're not decolonizing the curriculum, we have to decolonize the institution as well as decolonize the curriculum. So they can't kind of happen separate. They kind of need to be happen in sync. And I feel, in many sense, personally, that in terms of leadership and driving that conversation, it's really important to see who is driving it, or if anybody is driving that conversation. Just like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I agree with you, Tracy. It's been really interesting at the LSE, in that I've sort of encouraged staff to start with diversifying and thinking about what that means, and thinking about, like you say, their reading lists, because although we might think, oh, it's a really easy thing and we'll just do that, it's really difficult. And to get people to start changing reading lists or developing their reading lists, you get a lot of resistance. And I understand, I would feel the same if someone was telling me, well, your reading list is not good enough. So we've had quite a few departments do an audit of what they've got currently, and people will find that it's 70% white European North American literature that they tend to be quoting and using, and the difference between kind of like your main reading list versus recommended readings. And so we've really got people to develop some principles, like how would you kind of unpack your reading list? How would you do a coding exercise of kind of gender, ethnicity, race, where in the world you're taking your literature from, at what point in time? And that's been working really well. We've had really good kind of engagement from staff, from students. There's been a lot of staff-student partnership in that, where staff are bringing in students to do the work with them, and establishing principles and definitions and methodologies of how they do these audits, because the methods you employ are really important, and you have to be quite consistent. We're quite lucky at LSE because it's predominantly social sciences. So we started with that, Tracy, because I think, as I said, you'd have to strip apart the whole institution to get to decolonizing. I was at a talk a couple of months ago where they said you'd have to burn the whole place down and start again. And we can't burn the whole place down and start again. But we can be a bit more upfront about our histories and where our institutions have come from and what they were founded on, and then start talking about, and that is in our disciplines as well. As a geographer, it's an inherently, colonial subject, and it's that relationship as well. I've had a lot of discussion around decolonizing, post-colonialism. Where does this all fit in together for the different disciplines? But we've had really great projects that have worked really well around diversifying of the reading lists. And what we're trying to do in the next stage of it is actually using this concept of difficult dialogue in having conversations and presenting the reading list back to staff, to students, and getting to kind of get them understand how it can make some people feel, if you're solely concentrating on only 5 countries in the entire world, well, that's not a global reading list, is it? It's the idea of the global. What does that look like? Who are we including, and all of that? So I hope I've answered your question. I'm not sure I have, actually. Have I?
Yeah, I think it's really, you kind of said it at the very beginning that it's a continuum. There's no right or wrong starting point. There's no right or wrong finish point. And actually, there isn't a finish point, because if you think about how much our learner how diverse our learners have become, and are continuously shifting. And now with the war in Ukraine, we're going to have a lot of estranged children. We're going to have a lot of, people being displaced and things. So, our schools are opening up to young children, which in turn, in a few years, they won't all go back to the Ukraine and stuff. So we really have to be thinking about that moving forward. But as you say, there isn't a right or wrong. There isn't a start and an end. It'll be wherever you are, depending on the context. Because here in Northern Ireland, of course, we're very unique in our own context. And I suppose the term decolonizing has, even more, it has a different sense to somebody living in mainland UK as they do in Northern Ireland. So I think that's always a conversation that comes up as well. Jenny asked about, you mentioned the 6 sessions. with colleagues to explore racism in higher education. She's just wondering what the subject areas were, what the themes were, and was it a continuous theme threaded throughout the sessions, or were they separate themes?
So what we did with the sessions is I ran them all, and ideally you would have attended all of them and built up your knowledge bank, right? And then what we were trying to do is the themes were all, as I said, those were the titles of each of the sessions, and some of what I've delivered here today is part of some of that work that I facilitate at the LSE. It's very much using all of the data that LSE has collected over the last 10 years. We've had so many kind of student projects, focus groups, my research, my colleague Sarah Camacho Felix has done research on the student experience, and bringing all of that into one place. And you can't dispute when you say this is data about your own institution, this is data about your own department, these are the experiences of your students. It isn't something that's happening elsewhere. So we've really tried to highlight that and then give people the tools to talk about race, right? And understand sort of to talk about race is not necessarily to talk about decolonizing, they're not one in the same, and to start to remove the discomfort, okay? Because a lot of the work around diversification is about centering white comfort, and we tried really hard through these centres to decenter that, and for people to be able to go back to their departments and then do the work themselves rather than us. I could go into a department and run a session, but these were open to everybody across the school, and people from professors to professional staff that are also part of teaching, to people in careers were coming along, and how they used the information that we gave was entirely up to them. But we were really trying to that kind of train the trainer model. I'm really keen to be able to give people the tools to go back to their departments and then do the work themselves, because I think that is far more powerful than any conference, any external facilitator coming in can do. And it's it's that idea, we said, that building it into our structures, and that involves everybody. So yeah, I mean, maybe one day we'll open up those sessions to external people, but at the moment they're only for LSE staff. So
yeah, that's fair enough. We have done a couple of things, opened it up external, and other areas where we just wanted to give people a safer space to make it more kind of internal. And I think that working on both of those is kind of important, I suppose. I do have actually a resource I pulled together in a Padlet on decolonizing. It covers all different disciplines and things. So I'll try to, throughout the session, pull that out in a second, and I'll put it in the chat for people if they want it. So I still don't see any hands up. A lot of people, so I see Verna's in here as well. Hi, Verna. Such important work, keep it going. She used to head off, and sounds like very valuable work. So a lot of people saying thank you. You do have some references and whatnot in your slides, and we can pull those out later on, because Ben was asking any particular books or papers to get you started on decolonizing. And of course, it's like diversifying the curriculum. It's like anti-racism pedagogy, that they are slightly separate, but there are of course overlaps as well, and they're all focusing on different kind of things. So yeah, no, that's it. I think we're at 55 minutes. So I want to try to, I suppose, pause and give people a bit of a break between two sessions. So all the thank yous and whatnot will come in. So it's been a riveting talk, Akile, and I do really appreciate your time. And I'm sure from everybody in the room, they all want to say thank you, and you can give in your reactions a kind of an applause. Thanks very much. So I'm just going to pause there, and Ben will put back up the slide with the music. And just want to say thank you very much for being part of our conference. And everyone who's going to stay on, just make sure you keep engaging in the chat. So I just want to say thank you very much from everyone in QUB.
Thank you so much, Tracy, and everyone for coming along and listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much.